So as it's the 9th of April, I thought we would do a video on the Battle of Arras, technically called the Second Battle of Arras, which was really, we'd learned the lessons of the Somme the previous year, and everything came, not everything, wasn't quite the all-arms battle at this stage, did outrun the guns, ultimately, the artillery, and it did bog down, but it was a tremendous success. So, 9th of April, 1917, Arras is up in northeastern France, somewhere in the direction of Laon, which at the time was behind German lines, as was the key feature in fairly flat ground, which is Vimy Ridge. It's obviously quite a famous place. And on this day, it will be taken by the Canadians. So we have the British First Army under Horne. We have the British Third Army under Allenby. Fighting up, as I say, in the north, we have the Aussies, the Anzac Corps, and the Canadians. Well, the Canadians a little further north. And then we have, various Scottish, English divisions, and so on, scattered down. And basically, between the 9th and the 12th, a great deal of ground is outtaken until we've outrun the range of our artillery. Basically, it has a range of 6,500 yards. And of course, German guns, we sighted a couple of thousand yards behind their lines, so will ours. And we still hadn't quite learned, even though compared with the Somme, it was night and day, the counter battery fire was just devastating. In many places, troops were advancing with almost no casualties. Because the counter battery fire was so effective, and also the artillery spotting planes, RE8s and B2s and things like this, flying up above the whole time. The moment a German battery, they'd all been identified beforehand, or 95% of them had, and they were put under neutralising fire, they'd been doused in gas, and then there was a hurricane bombardment lasting 3 minutes before the main assault. They also blew up 2 massive mines on Vimy Ridge. As I say, what would happen, these artillery spotters, if they did see a German field gun still in action, they would immediately radio that down, and it would get taken out. And it was horrible weather, by the way. It was snowing up there and sleeting, and it was really vile weather. And in these planes with pretty much open cockpits, they were describing how they could hardly see, and they're getting thrown around so much. One of the artillery spotters, he just couldn't stop vomiting, and so they had to land and get a new one. But the pilot still went up again. But anyway, I was just going to talk about the actual taking of these trenches, because I heard 3 different accounts, and they were all different. I don't have the names of the soldiers involved, but it was interesting. So there was one account of a group of Canadian soldiers that went forward, and they found that, to be honest, the German trenches had been smashed. They went through the first line trenches, the first line system, into the second line system, and even there, the artillery had done its job, and they were just mopping up. Most of the Germans were surrendering. They came across a tunnel, and there was a bunch of Germans in the tunnel, and we don't have an account of what happened outside, but we have an account actually from a German on this occasion. He was only a young lad, like 18 or whatever, and suddenly the cry goes up, "It's Tommies, Tommies!" And then he says in his account, "Damn, it's the English." And it wasn't, it was actually Canadians, but they called everyone English for some reason, even, everyone was English to them. And apparently we were the main enemy in the war, Gott strafe England and all that kind of stuff. May God punish England was their greeting, apparently. But anyway, the cry went up, "Tommies, Tommies, it's the English." And all of the enlisted men just immediately surrendered. They just walked out of this tunnel system because they knew they'd surrounded. And it was very merciful, because they could have just tossed in a load of Mills bombs and killed a lot of them. But they didn't. But apparently they had he calls him an older hand, but he was at the NCO. He was actually 22. And they said he was given a bit of lip to one of these Canadian troops. And then apparently he wished that he hadn't, because the dude had a baseball bat. And he said the Canadian dude smashed the NCO around the head with a baseball bat, just because apparently he was surrendering, but he wasn't doing it very politely. He was, Oh, I tell you what it was, I remember now. It's because when he looked at the Canadian soldier and glared at him, he then spat on the ground. And and then he got hit with a baseball bat around the head for his troubles. And then the one that's actually giving the account of this, the German, he said he immediately just put his hands over his head because he thought he was going to get smashed with a baseball bat next. But he wasn't. He was just being shouted at, keep your hands on the head, keep your hands there. And then by that time as well, we'd learned how to mop up properly. Again, something we hadn't been able to do at the Somme. And these were being sent back to British lines, disarmed and covered the whole time. There was another account, I believe this again was the Canadians, and they came across a pillbox, and they would use trench mortars against pillboxes very effectively, and again, machine gun posts. But they came across the pillbox, and they realised there were still some Germans down inside it. And there was a German cowering in a trench, and they said he was just basically blubbering. And they were shouting at him and pointing, saying, go in that pillbox, go in that pillbox, tell them to come out. And, I don't know whether the German even understood, but apparently he was just a nervous wreck from what had been happening, and he absolutely refused to go and tell his mates to get out of the pillbox. So again, they mopped him up, just sent him back. And what they did here was incredibly merciful. The normal tactic, to be honest, would just be to chuck in, again, Mills bombs down if you know that there's a deep dugout and there's Germans in there still. They didn't. They chucked in a couple of smoke grenades instead. And then the Germans all came out with their hands on their heads and were all taken prisoner. So and they're wearing gas masks, actually, which presumably offered them some protection from the smoke grenades. But it was enough to convince them all to surrender anyway, and they all just walked out peacefully. And that was that. They were all just shouted out to keep their hands up. They checked they didn't have any weapons on them. None of them did. And they sent them back. There was one other account, actually. A couple, actually. So this was this was the British Third Army, and it was some Scots. And their account, actually, I wish I had the transcript, but I would have had to have sanitised it, because they weren't in a very good mood. They were, again, penetrating deep further south. They penetrated very deep, actually. It ultimately went too far, but they were a bit less merciful. What they were doing, they were seeing trenches, and they were just chucking in grenades. And into these, there was a deep dugout. They knew there were Germans in there. They chucked in one of them chucks in one hand grenade, Mills bomb, and then he says his mate chucked in another two, just for good measure. Remarkably, 3 Germans survived, sorry. And the whole time, the Scottish are shouting, basically, get out, you effers, effing get out. And they're literally just constantly swearing and shouting at any German they see. And the Germans are terrified. They're hit by such a barrage of bombardment that, some of them are resisting, but they're getting taken out. 3 of them, as I say, clamber out the dugout, and they said they were just absolutely terrified. But the Scottish guy wasn't being merciful. He must have killed a load of them already by the grenades that they've thrown in. But 3 of them managed to come out. And again, these are young lads, because Germany is already getting very short on manpower. And what he said was, we checked them over. We weren't having any of that. They were all saying, Kamerad, Kamerade, Kamerade, comrade. And he's like, effing comrade of mine, mate. And apparently what they did, they took their weapons off them, pointed back to their, go back toward our lines, you're being taken prisoner. And he said, we gave each of them a kick up the arse to hurry them up, which I thought was rather nice. But again, there were other instances of Germans being a lot more spiteful in their resistance. They came into one trench, for example, and again, most of them have been taken out by the shell fire, the artillery. That was really what did the killing. Obviously, 60% of casualties were from artillery. We all think it's machine guns, but it was much more the artillery. There was a German lying on the ground, and they said, well, either he was absolutely terrified or he was just dying. They weren't really sure. He just appeared to be kind of on the ground, not moving. But then the soldiers just press on because they think this dude has clearly had it. But he pulls out an automatic gun, and he tries to shoot the Batman of the captain. It was Captain Moneypenny, that one. I remember the name because I was thinking of James Bond. He pulled out his pistol. Even, I don't know if he was feigning, near death, or whether, he was actually seriously injured. But either way, they said that's the last thing he ever did. So I think we can guess what happened there. But it's just interesting. We often hear that the Canadians were famous for not taking prisoners. And yet we had an account here where the Canadians were merciful, throwing in smoke bombs rather than hand grenades, and this kind of thing. And also it's interesting that we always hear, the Germans are absolutely terrified of Aussies, for example. They're absolutely terrified of Canadians. They knew they didn't take prisoners. This is obviously a lie. They all called them English. They appeared not to know that they were Canadians in that case. So I think sometimes we exaggerate this national thing. They're just all the enemy, basically. But yeah, so 9th of April, very successful. Unfortunately, further south, this was really meant to be a prelude to a much larger battle called the Novell Offensives, which are also beginning at the same time. And, this is when the French took such heavy casualties after such high hopes that basically the French army went into revolt. I'm trying to think if I think they court-martialed Novell for it. He certainly never commanded again. And of course they brought in Pétain, who'd been the saviour of Verdun, to restore order. But basically after that, the French were a spent force, really. They refused to attack. They would only defend. And that's really where, for the rest of the war, Britain takes on the predominant role, whereas previously it had obviously been the French. That's obviously a big oversimplification. They did do further attacks. But amazingly, despite all these revolts, remarkably few executions by Pétain. Only a few ringleaders were executed. So he restored order. But remarkably, it would appear the Germans never knew that the French army was something of revolt. Otherwise, it might have been a prime time for them to mount a big counterattack. But anyway, so this would rumble. In terms of the British attack, I think it went on. The main advances were between about the 9th and the 12th, really, and then we'd outstrip the artillery. But the taking of Vimy Ridge was a great achievement. And all in all, compared with the Somme the previous year, the British had learned an awful lot. And primarily, again, it was spotting artillery places and neutralising them. And interestingly, when I say neutralising, I don't necessarily mean blowing them up. There are reports of them finding German guns, and they even a day and a half later and stuff, and saying where they were, because they would sight them in little depressions and little defiles where they, can't be sort of flash spotted in sound range. They have to be spotted by aircraft. And some of them, often, if it was in a bit of a crater, as they would like to sight them, they would be deluged in gas. There was large use of gas. I don't think we were really doing mustard gas at this stage. I think it would have probably been chlorine, would it not? I don't think we were using phosgene at that stage either. But apparently there were still clouds of gas over these guns, 36 hours later, because it would just sort of settle. It's a little bit heavier than air. And if there's not much of a wind, it would kind of stay there. I have to check on that. I can't remember precisely. Obviously, the Germans brought in mustard gas first, then we replicated it. We certainly, I don't believe, had vast quantities at that point, if any. But yeah, this was the thing. So drenching the position with gas shells, and then so the term neutralisation, the gun itself, if it was chlorine, it would have severely damaged it in terms of doing a halide reaction with the metal and stuff. But the idea was just plaster them so closely with either gas or with high explosive that even if you can't physically hit the gun, it's just too dangerous for the gunners to be there. And this is what's happening. And then the few that were, as I say, still firing, they had all these reconnaissance aircraft flying over, and because they pre-sighted, pre-registered all the guns. This is an interesting point about field guns as well, like 4.5-inch howitzer. And I say field guns, this is, I suppose that's probably the wrong term. This is long-range howitzers. The thing with them, every barrel is different, and every time you use them, the barrel wears a little bit. And so even if you have the precise same model of gun, depending on how much it's been fired, it will have a different range, slightly different range. And so you would have to pre-register it elsewhere, and then you knew the precise sort of ballistic characteristics of this specific weapon. And yeah, so this is what they've done. They pre-registered them, pre-registered the targets, and then, of course, right before the attack, we didn't make the mistake of the Somme, of kind of stopping the fire and then walking across no man's land. No, it was a hurricane bombardment, picking out all these pre-sight. We basically didn't pre-range, we didn't pre-sight any of the German field gun positions on the Somme, and again, most of it was left intact. Hence, but even through the Battle of the Somme, I know it rumbled on all the way from July to November. We did learn a lot there, and it came into play in the Battle of Arras. So just a little thought, spare thought for those blokes down there fighting in fighting through that snow and that sleet, and some of them obviously it was the first time going to battle, and one of the guys said, I saw a couple of Germans that presumably had been hit by shell fire. He said, and he said it was gruesome. The dude didn't have a head. There was another one who was attacking, and his mate right by his side got hit by a machine gun, and it just practically cut the dude in half. The power of machine gun bullets. And you don't see where they're coming from. It's not like in the films where there's a gun pointing straight at you. No, they're crisscrossing from a long way away. I mean, they have a range of 3,000 or 4,000 yards, a Maxim gun. You don't see it until it cuts you in half, and that's what happened to his mate. But pretty. It was pretty heavy stuff, but it was a very effective offensive, at least from the British and Anzac and Australian point of view.